Thank you, Bob. My name is Elisa Garr. I'm the Executive Director of First Star, which is a national 501c3 public charity dedicated to improving the lives of victimized and abused children for over a decade. Our mission is to shed light on the issues facing society's most vulnerable children, since these children are often unable to do so themselves. I am pleased to address you today in conjunction with the release of the latest report card on state secrecy and child deaths, prepared by Kai and First Star. I wanted to offer you a perspective on one state, Maryland, our neighbor. What has happened in Maryland is instructive on why doing the report cards and then circling back to take a second look is so vitally important. It is important to make sure that progress is made in the states where progress is needed, where a low or failing grade indicates the need for action. However, Maryland's experience also underscores the fact that changing state laws may not be an adequate solution. A national solution to the issue of child deaths is in fact necessary. When First Star and Kai produced the first report card on state secrecy in April of 2007, Maryland's then existing law received an F. In light of this abysmal grade, child advocates in Maryland worked with great energy and purpose to improve the law to enhance the accountability of the Department of Human Resources in Maryland. Their effort led to the passage of a law in 2010 that, at least on paper, would have been a significant improvement. The law had an effective date of October 1st, 2010, and First Star reached out to Maryland officials to determine how the state intended to handle implementation. The Department of Human Resources, at the outset, refused to develop regulations to implement the law, which would have subjected the agency to discernible standards and provided transparency and accountability. A lengthy process ensued while First Star waited for information that should have been readily provided. At long last, by letter dated August 19, 2011, the Department of Human Resources responded to First Star's standing request for information, providing limited information about 3 children who died in Maryland and whose families had no active child welfare case at the time of death and had no prior history of child welfare services. Thus, the Department of Human Resources released information only about children with whom it had no previous connection or responsibility. The Department of Human Resources further noted that it was not providing information about cases which were ruled out, even though the law does not provide an exception for such cases. First Star has received no additional information in response to its standing request. A comparison of sheer numbers with child fatality data maintained nationally indicates a significant discrepancy. Data from Maryland from the National Clearinghouse on Child Abuse and Neglect indicate that the numbers of child fatalities was 20, 17, and 24 respectively for each of 2008, 2009, and 2010. Yet, in the several years since Maryland's law was changed, only 3 deaths have been found by the Department of Human Resources to be reportable. The second report card provides the opportunity to take a second look at Maryland and to see what, if any, progress it is making. First Star believes that the state can do better, even under the existing law. We also believe that a national solution in the form of strengthening CAPTA's requirement that states enact laws that will provide for constructive disclosure of child deaths is warranted. We urge you to support this effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisa. I guess it won't make you feel any better to know that in California, the Department of Social Services adopted their regulations, and their regulations contract the law, moving us from an A to a C+, among other things, they contend that only if the abuse and neglect is caused by the parent, not by the child care center, or the educator, or a sibling, or someone else, is it reportable. And they have about 4 or 5 other requirements as well before they're reported. So we have a problem with not only having a second edition, we're going to have a third edition, and I suspect a fourth and a fifth, because we're going to have to keep on these folks, because if they can secrete and conceal what's happening, they will. They perceive it to be in their interest to conceal what they're doing because they're afraid of the consequences of failure. And although it's possible to over-accuse, it's also an imbalance if you don't know. So I want to conclude our presentations by having our final speaker here, Kimberly Day. She's the coordinator for the National Coalition to End Child Abuse Deaths, based here in Washington, D.C., a very important organization, and she has a great deal of experience, over 25 years in the field of children's services, and as well as 15 years or so in the child welfare field, so we're very happy to have her here to talk about this precise issue.
Good afternoon. My name is Kimberly Day, and I am from the National Coalition to End Child Abuse Deaths. And the mission of the Coalition to End Child Abuse Deaths is to elevate and increase actions to reduce child abuse and to prevent child abuse fatalities, of which there are 8 every day in the United States. The highest number of child abuse fatalities in all of the industrialized countries in the world, which is pretty amazing, really. Our coalition came together in 2009 at the Summit to End Child Abuse Deaths, where we brought 150 child welfare, not just child welfare experts, but really experts in child abuse and neglect together to look at research and have discussions, and we came up with 10 recommendations for the child welfare system. But what became, I think, strikingly apparent was the complexity of our child welfare system, but also the need for a national strategy to address the problems. Some of the things that we know are important is that child abuse and neglect deaths are preventable. This isn't something that we just have to accept and live with, that there are just 2,500 child abuse deaths in the United States. We can prevent these deaths. We know that varying contributions and policies among states make children safer in some states than they are in others. Often, child welfare policies are created in reaction to tragedies, and laws and reforms swing from more to less restrictive, not necessarily making children any safer when that happens. A lot of these reforms actually change when administrations change in states. We know also that it's not the responsibility, or the responsibility for the welfare and the safety of our children cannot rest only on individual states or individual administrations or even individual child welfare workers, that it's all of our responsibility to make sure that our children are safe and well cared for. Because of the complexity and diversity of our system, and because the lives of thousands of children are at stake, we need a national strategy to prevent child abuse and to reduce child abuse deaths. The Protect Our Kids Act would help us develop that strategy. The Protect Our Kids Act would create a national commission to evaluate and study the entire system, not just the child welfare system, but really before the child welfare system, because it looks at prevention and it looks all the way from prevention to protection. It looks at our child welfare workforce, yes, but it also looks at confidentiality laws. It looks at how we count child abuse fatalities and how we even identify child abuse fatalities. It would look at model protocols for states. There would be 10 hearings across the country. In states that do a great job, and we learn from them. In states that don't do such a great job, so we can also learn from them. It would potentially make groundbreaking recommendations that state and local systems could then utilize to protect our most vulnerable children. And if people have any questions about the Protect Our Kids Act after this is over, I'd be happy to answer your questions, but Megan Thompson is also here from Senator Kerry's office to answer questions. Thanks.
I want to thank you all for coming, and wanted to allow a few minutes now for questions. And if you have questions you want to ask individual panelists after we leave the apartment, we'll all be staying, most of us will be staying around at least for a short time to be able to answer those questions. Do you have any questions of anyone who would like to ask any individual member of the panel? You're all fully briefed now, yes?
I'm appalled at the behaviour of people who abuse children, of course, and all these kind of things. I think it's a dreadful behaviour. What makes people behave like that? And it seems to me having information about it is very important. But what's the cause of this? Is it poverty, poor education, resentment at having children they didn't want? And I think these are the causes. Nobody addressed this. You affect the results, taking care, counting, accurate records and so on. But it seems to me it's a societal problem and it has causes that are not being addressed.
Well, of course, I do, I'm very much in tune with your thesis, and a lot of my writing does in fact delve into that, issues such as the decision to have a child, how it should be made, who should make it, the decisions, cultural decisions and cultural values we have or don't have, parenting education. How come we don't have parenting education? I mean, I didn't use trigonometry much, after high school, believe it or not, but, I could have used parenting education, and I know a lot of my peers could have used it as well. There are a lot of cultural problems we have in this country involving children and a lack of regard for them and a lack of training for them that lies behind the prevention problem and thesis that the questioner was asking about. And yes, I think one of the points that Danielle is making, and I think one of the points that Lisa and I are also making, is this act will create a commission that will look at that, and I expect it to look at that. I expect it to look not just at what do we do after there is, but why, and what are the variables that cause it. And poverty is undoubtedly one of them, but there are others. And I would like to explore that in great detail. I'd like to do so in an unafraid fashion without any political correctness. Just what are the correlations and what are the causes? And I don't care who gets burned. Okay, that's my, go ahead.
I just want to,
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to address that very briefly also. I think it's important to recognize that there are many phases that one can engage in advocacy when it comes to child abuse and child neglect. You can engage in advocacy on the prevention level. You can engage in advocacy on behalf of the children who are in care at the moment who have already experienced abuse or neglect. Or you can engage in advocacy to do something with what has already happened to those children. So we're coming into this on this particular issue from the latter angle, trying to address, this is the very, very tail end of what can happen. This is the worst of the worst of the worst case scenario of what can happen after prevention doesn't work and after the child has suffered. We're talking about kids who've been killed or almost been killed. So the purpose that we're trying to address today is, after everything else has failed, what do we do with this information that we have about what happened to the worst in the worst case scenarios? And for God's sakes, let's at least make good use of that data to prevent what's happened to those kids from happening to other kids.
Other questions? Yes?
I'm from Georgia. We went from an F to a B. But like California, I'm now looking at how can we do better, and I'm seeing a reclassification of some of the fatalities in our state, some of the information that's been put out, because of two legal definitions, one being the caretaker definition, and the second being neglect, that we have a very narrow neglect. But I see that we now have kind of a new category in our child fatality review of, we have hundreds of deaths that are due to lack of parental supervision. But yet neglect was not charged in the death, therefore they're not categorized as a child maltreatment fatality. And how do we address that?
Let me just say that what we're looking at, by the way, I have lots of friends in Georgia, including my former student, Kristen Widener, who's the head of research at Emory, and I'm kind of familiar with what Georgia's doing. And one of the problems I think Georgia has is the same problem California is having, and that is, yes, you move up, maybe in the statute, but how are they implementing it? How are they interpreting the terms of the statute? We are comparing statutes and rules here, things that are actually published to provide a floor. We can have what appears to be a reasonable floor of a B, and yet all you have to do is interpret child abuse or child neglect in a narrow way under the statute, and you have the same problem of not revealing the information. Utah's having the same problem. Utah's contacting us as advocates there, and they're saying, well, we moved up to an A, but look what's happening. I can't get this in. It's funny because all you have to do is you could say yes to 5 aspects of our test and no to number 6, and you don't get the information. And that's the problem we have. The problem we have in comparing between states is all we can do really is compare what they've written down, because how they apply it will vary between county. We want them to write it down in a way that is enforceable. Now, I hope in Georgia, someone, maybe Kirsten, or someone will file a lawsuit to make the courts interpret the law, I think, consistent with legislative intent, which would be your interpretation, not theirs. Any other questions? Yes?
This is a question for Kimberly Day.
Yes.
If the Protect Act is enacted, do you anticipate that the Commission would, in addition to looking at laws, look at identifying the level of funding needed to support the child welfare system? There was a hearing in the Senate back in December 2011 talking about child abuse and neglect, and one consistent theme was that there's a significant underfunding within the child welfare system, and in particular at the local level.
Yeah.
And also for some of the programs that address substance abuse, home visitation,
Yeah.
and other programs.
The commission would actually have sitting on it experts in substance abuse and mental health, from the mental health field and from a range of different professions. So that, what you're talking about there, would be covered. But also, it would look at a range. The goal of the commission is to reduce child abuse fatalities. So you can't help but talk about what are the causes for child abuse fatalities, and you also can't help but reduce child abuse while you're at it if you're reducing fatalities. And resources for states to carry out this work, I mean, it's certainly a very, very important factor. And having been a child welfare worker myself in the past, I know what it's like to work in that job. And I also talk to lots of states about this issue, and they'll call and they'll say, are you surprised about what you heard? Are you surprised with the statistic you're hearing from Wisconsin? And I would say, I'm not really surprised, because I hear the same thing in every state. This isn't a Wisconsin problem or a Texas problem. This is a national problem. We need to look at it as a national problem. And the child welfare systems are sort of set up in a way, and they don't do themselves any favors by not being good at PR, and having good conversations about what's really happening. But at the same time, they're set up in a system that doesn't have enough resources. And I feel like, some of the pushback that we've had about this bill has been states' rights, but I think that if you had a thorough evaluation of our national child welfare system, then we would come up with recommendations for states that they would want to utilize to reduce child fatalities and protect children. But they would also have to have the resources to help them do that.
Because from what I'm reading, states are actually requiring some child welfare staff as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming, and thank my colleagues in the panel. It's a privilege for me to be associated with all of them. You've been a very thoughtful audience. Thank you.
Please feel free to stay for the next 25 minutes. We have the room and refreshments for you all, and talk amongst yourselves.
Right.